All right, we're going to be going over some models for Lab 1, Orientation to the Human Body. So this is our torso model here, and I'm going to be going over some of the body cavities as well as the organs that are located within the body cavities. We're going to start with the ventral cavity. The ventral cavity is located on the anterior aspect, which means the front of the body, and the ventral cavity is not completely encased with bone, although it is protected, the thoracic cavity especially, by the rib cage. So the ventral cavity is going to be divided into two different cavities. So in the top here, with the lungs and the heart, we have the thoracic cavity. So this is the thoracic cavity, and we can see, if we take some of these organs out, that this part right here is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle. It's very important. It's going to be dividing the thoracic cavity above and separating it from the abdominopelvic cavity below. So this cavity up here is the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is going to contain the heart, the lungs, the trachea, the great vessels. It can also be subdivided into some other cavities. So in the middle of the thoracic cavity here, we have the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is going to be dividing the thoracic cavity. It comes straight down the middle, and it contains the great vessels, it contains the esophagus, it contains the top part of the trachea. And then it's also going to contain the heart, and the heart is going to be sort of within the mediastinum, and the heart is going to be surrounded by its own serous membranes called the pericardium. The mediastinum is also going to divide. It comes right in between the right and the left lungs, and so here we've got the right lung over here and the left lung over here, and each of these lungs is going to be encased by its own serous membrane also. They're called the pleural serous membranes. So we have the lungs over here, and you can see that this is the lung, this is the cut surface of the lung, this is the heart, and it's attached to the great vessels, and then here's the other lung up here. And all of those are going to be within the thoracic cavity. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the serous membranes once I go through the rest of this, on a different model, once I go through the rest of this model. So now we're going to move down. We have the diaphragm here. The diaphragm is going to be dividing the thoracic cavity and separating it from the abdominopelvic cavity. And so in the abdominopelvic cavity, we have a lot of organs. So we're going to name some of the organs now. So this big guy over here that's on the right side is the liver. And so this whole thing here is the liver, and if we flip it over here, you can see that this green part is the gallbladder. Next, we have the stomach. This is the stomach, and this model opens, and we can see the folds and the interior of the stomach. Under here, this is this brown part is going to be the large intestine or large colon, and in our 169, we'll learn all the different names for the different parts of the large intestine and small intestine, but for now, just start learning large intestine here. So this is the darker, larger part of it, and then this part here is going to be the small intestine. So we have the small intestine that we can remove, and we can see here, this is more of your large intestine. Now sitting right here, and it's very close to the first part of your small intestine, and it sits right below the stomach, this guy is the pancreas. It can be a little bit hard to identify sometimes, so remember that's the pancreas. And then down here, at the bottom of the large colon, if we flip this over, you can see there's a little worm-like tail here. This is called the appendix, or the vermiform appendix, so it looks a little like a worm. Now that we've removed these organs that are more superficial, we can look at some of the deeper organs. So we have the kidneys in the back here. The kidneys have the adrenal glands sitting right on top of them, and then this little guy in the back here is going to be the spleen. Now, we can pretty easily see here the abdominopelvic cavity, and so at the top we have the diaphragm, and the bottom we've got the pelvis. The abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are not separated by something that's specific like the diaphragm, and so really the difference is that the pelvic cavity is going to be lower in here, and it's actually going to be like protected by the pelvis, whereas the abdominal cavity is higher and not protected by the pelvis. And the organs can freely move sort of, up and down, especially the uterus in the case of pregnancy is going to, expand from its normal area in the pelvis up into the abdomen. So a lot of people just call it the abdominopelvic cavity. But these organs down here, so we have the bladder, and if this were a female model, you'd also have the uterus, and the ovaries would be down here in the pelvic cavity. Here we can see the testes over here since this is a male model. As we said, the abdominal cavity would be higher here. Other things that we can see, so we can see that the kidneys here are attached to the bladder by the ureters. All right. So we're going to turn the model around now and talk about the posterior aspect. So the posterior aspect is going to include the cranial cavity, which is here, the cranial cavity, and the vertebral cavity, which is down here. Both of these are fully encased in bone, and they contain the brain in the cranial cavity and the spinal cord in the vertebral cavity. And these are also going to be surrounded by their own membranes called the meninges that we'll learn more about when we get to the nervous system. All right, so the posterior aspect has the cranial cavity, which contains the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which contains the spinal cord. We'll learn lots more about that when we get to the nervous system.